My name is Nara Murillo. I'm the host of Agewell Avenue podcast, and my co-host is Barbara Slingloff.
On this show, we talk about navigating healthcare, housing, investing, and advocating for our seniors.
Everyone, my name is Nara Murillo, and my co-host today is Barbara, one of my really good friends. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I've known Nara for a long time, many years. And I think one of the things that will be important is that because I know her so well, I think what will be important is for the help that she wants to give, it'll be important for you to know more about her. So I think it will be interesting to hear you share about what your childhood was like and how that affected your life, because I know you weren't born here in the US. So why don't you share a little bit about where you were from?
Sounds good. Would love to. So I was actually born in Armenia, in the city of Yerevan. So I am an only child to my parents. And, back home, it was very different. And, 14 years of my life, I was living there, and very different world. And you have to remember, this was back in the 90s when I came here. But as a child growing up, we lived in a two-story home. And obviously the structure of the families and the housing was very different. The way our house was, we had a good size house, and our downstairs was separated from the upstairs. And so we had downstairs at the beginning of my childhood. I was younger. We had tenants because it was separated from the upstairs floor. So it was always interesting. As a kid, you wonder, why is there people living underneath my house, as you're getting older. And so eventually they left. And I don't know how that situation happened, obviously, with my parents. And I also lived with my grandmother. My grandfather passed away when I was 3 years old, so I don't really remember him. But I remember my grandmother very well because we lived together. And so, I remember, us being in the house, and how it was. Our house was very different. Eventually, once the tenants moved out, my dad actually opened up a staircase from our upstairs to going into downstairs. And so eventually we had access to the downstairs from upstairs. But basically, it was my dad added more to the house, and kind of, and this is the funny part. In the beginning, when I was little, and I'm sure there's still countries that have this, we had our toilet outside. So it wasn't inside of the house. And so we used to go there, and it was just terrible because, back home we have four seasons. And so, during the winter time, it was freezing, so, and eventually my dad got tired of that. And so he decided to basically expand the house, moving forward, because we had so much space from the street to our property, that he was able to extend out, and also built a bathroom inside the house with shower, and also extend our kitchen, making it bigger. So it was just, he was basically able to change our whole entire house. And so, but basically we had different furniture. The furniture wasn't really, I mean, yes, there are some similarities now, with some china cabinets, but the china cabinets were very different. They were wall to wall, and so you had all kinds of, your crystals showing, your china showing. It was very, but everybody had it. It was just one of those things that it was just, you owned it in your house. And remembering back now, we all lived so similarly. Everybody lived very similarly. So there wasn't really competition with people, because that's just how we all lived. You didn't know anything else, you know. Majority of the people lived like that, and they were actually happy, you know, living that way. And so, you know, I remember we had the china cabinet and the couch, and our closets were different. We had wardrobes, and our beds were very different. They were like from metal, you know, like stainless steel kind of a metal type of thing, you know. So it was just very different. Our windows were built differently. Our windows had places where we could actually sit. So it was just very, very different the way that our houses were, and where our house was, the way that our street was. It was like one big street, and we had houses on one side, which my house was on, obviously the parts where the houses were, and then in the front of it we had apartment buildings, and it was like layers of apartment buildings, you know. So it was just very different. It wasn't like your traditional, we all came out and we played on the street, even though there would cars come by, you know, but we all the kids would go out and just play. We all would get together, you know. So it was just very, very, you know, very tight knit community. And we also had, the way that our streets were, we also had a lot of adjacent streets that you could go into. Like next to our house, you could go into it, and there was more homes in the back where people actually lived with their families. And so it was just, you know, you had it more in the back too, as far as like the houses go. But it was just not your typical like streets like here, you know? So, but I think that's kind of in a nutshell is where I kind of grew up, and just kind of giving an overview of like what the street looked like, and everything.
And tell us about mom and dad. What did mom and dad do, and what was their role at that time?
So, and mom was mainly home with grandma, and you know, traditionally back home it was that way. You know, a lot of the men worked, and the women stayed in the house, and they took care of the children, they took care of the house, and the cooking and the cleaning, and then the men went out to work and, you know, provide. And so my dad was actually, so when I was born, my dad went into the military, so he was gone for a couple of years. So my mom actually stayed with my grandparents. And so, you know, with me, and she went and visited him. My dad was stationed in Russia, in a little kind of a almost like a city called Sochi. It was right by the water. So my mom actually went with me a few times to visit him. And so but yeah, I mean, that was, and then after, you know, he came out of the military, um you know, he was working, he was driving trucks. And so so he basically had his own, you know, company that he was just basically working for, almost, I think it was like his own truck, and he was just driving for himself. um and I think that, you know, a lot of I mean, most of us lived with our you know, back home it was that way. A lot of the families, even when you got married, we all kind of lived together. You know, if you had, you know, three sons, for example, you know, they would have a big enough house, or they would try to build on the house to have enough rooms for each son, because they all lived in one house. So for us, even though my dad had two other siblings, had a brother and a sister, and my mom had four additional sisters. But my obviously, when the girls get married, they go into the men's house, right? Their husband's house. So they go as a bride, and that's just kind of how it was. And the men usually, you know, stayed in the home. But because my aunt got married and left, and my uncle was younger, so he was actually living with us. So it was
Wow.
just me as the child, you know? So, yeah.
And did what was transportation looking like? Did everyone drive, or did you have a car?
Yeah, so that's another thing that's a little bit, that was a little bit different. Me growing up, I think it's a little bit different now, obviously, but me growing up at the time, women didn't drive. we either took buses or we took the trolley, or they had taxis. But my dad did have a car. They did have my dad had two cars. One of them was like a military kind of a Jeep, and then the other one was more of a sports car. But yeah, I mean, he used to drive, and then obviously he had his truck too. But yeah, that was kind of how we got around. But me as a child, it was always taking the bus everywhere. You're just used to that, so that's what we did.
One of the things that I hear often and I'm most fascinated about is when people come here from another country, one of the first thing that they say strikes them most is when they see one of our grocery stores and they go shopping for food for the first time, because
Hmm.
there are these large stores and there's all this food in carts that you can just load up with whatever you want. Maybe you can share
Hmm.
about how did you get food? What did grocery stores look like? How was that for you where you were?
Yeah, so it was definitely different than here. There was separate stores, for like bread and dairy and meat and poultry, and we would go to the bazaar. We had a bazaar for produce, and so I remember being 7, and I was doing like the produce shopping, at the bazaar, and I would just go and try to, negotiate on how much it was. And I mean, back then we would pay 3 cents for, like a little, bundle of like cilantro or parsley. You know what I mean? It was that cheap. And so, but we would still try to, make it as like, try to buy it as cheap as we could. And so, but at that time, I remember everything was great. We had enough, food. Like our stores were full, and everything was great until I was about 10. And after the revolution, when Armenia separated from Russia, food stopped shipping to Armenia, and so it was just so difficult. The government started providing coupons for us, because they knew how many people you had in the family, and so they would provide us with coupons to go pick up, a certain amount of, I think we were getting like maybe 2 pounds or 3 pounds of butter, or like 2 or 3 pounds of cheese for the month, and we were only allowed to get, I think one or two bread for the month, so it was just, and I remember because we used to live really close to my dad's uncle. And so I remember going with him and standing in lines at like 3 or 4 in the morning to try to, buy something and bring it for the family. I would just go with them, and so, and we would just find out, where they were having, they were getting butter, or which store was getting cheese. And sometimes we had to travel to the city, to be able to get, whatever we needed. Or, because even though they were giving you coupons, not every store was carrying, the butter or the cheese. You had to wait to find out, and everybody would tell each other, I mean, oh, the store is going to be getting this day, so that's kind of how we shopped and did things at that time, because that we didn't have any other option, and that's just what it was. So
Did you find that same experience when you came here and you went to the grocery store and you just saw the carts and all the food and you could just pick out whatever you wanted?
oh my goodness, I think it was just one of the most shocking experiences for me. I was just thinking, oh my goodness, like, is this for real? Like, are we really able to come to the store and just buy anything, right? And I think right now back home, it's similar. They have stores not as big as probably supermarkets like here, but they still have good sized stores that still carry everything else that it's just expensive. But back then we didn't have any of that. So when I came, I was just like, are we really able to buy whatever we want? Like, I was in shock. Like, I think that the first time we went shopping, we got everything that we were like wanting, and you don't realize it, right? Because you're coming from a country that you didn't have any of this, right? So you're just thinking, oh, let me just pick up whatever I can pick up. But you realize, okay, you're not going to be able to eat all that, and then it's going to go bad. You know what I mean? So you realize these things have expirations, you know what I mean? So it's
Right.
very different. And
Right.
I think it was challenging too, because, I didn't speak a word of English, at the time when I came. So it was very challenging for us to go, even to be able to shop, because they would ask us questions and I didn't know what to say. All I knew was yes and no. That was it. That's all I knew. I spoke, three languages. At the time I spoke Armenian, Russian, and French. And so I didn't know a word of English. I'd never studied it. So I had no idea what these people were talking about. All I knew was just yes and no. That was it. So sometimes it was challenging, but yeah, that was interesting times
And
for
tell
sure.
uh, clearly, I
Yeah.
never get tired of hearing, and what it does is it really allows me to hear that, and it allows me to be more appreciative. If you've always grown up here, we are very fortunate to just go to a store and get whatever we want whenever we need it. I think the pandemic created a different kind of feeling for us for the first time.
Hmm.
For those that didn't live through the depression and when things were really tight. So I have a great appreciation for how fortunate we are here. Um, Tell me a little bit
Absolutely.
about your, you've talked about the food, and tell me about, um, was clothing difficult to get as well if things weren't shipping? Did people make clothes? Did you buy them? How did that work?
Yeah. So, I mean, going to school, I obviously wore a uniform. So in the wintertime, we had a different uniform. And then in the summertime, we had a different uniform. But we had one big store that usually carried uniforms. So we used to always go to that store and, buy the uniforms there. Majority of the time, because dad, traveled a lot, while driving the truck, he would go to different places. Like he would go to Russia, and also there was, back home, a lot of people had relatives in different places, right? So like they would come visit, family in the US, or they would, go do some tourism, like in just different countries, right? Turkey, or Europe. And they would bring stuff, to sell. So we would buy a lot of things from the homes that we would just, again, everything was word of mouth. You know what I mean? Like they would say, oh, so and so came back from Europe, so they have stuff that, they're selling. So we would just go and either buy it from there, or whatever my dad would bring back from, from Moscow or wherever he was in Russia, or he would, Czech Republic, or whatever he would go, he would always bring me clothes. And always, as a little girl, they always had me in big, hair. My hair was always done. They would always, give me like these big bows on my head. It was covering my whole head. So, that's kind of, and I was always, I always had, everything matching, everything had to match. And, it was just one of those things that when you're an only child too, everything kind of comes to you, right? They're doing everything for you. So, but that was kind of how we did a lot of our shopping. And, I mean, everything from jewelry, and that's kind of how we bought it. And then eventually there were little boutiques where you would go, and you could buy shoes, and jewelry, and like purses and things like that. So they had, like, we would go to the city, for that, and they would have like little boutiques that carry things like that. Um, but I think that was in a nutshell how we really shopped for clothing, mainly.
And you mentioned uniforms, and so, um, here when you start school, you go to preschool, you go to kindergarten. Did you have the same similar things? How was school structured for you?
Yeah, so it was so kindergarten was first, and interestingly enough, my mom actually ended up for a very short period of time working there because I was there, and so she would, kind of try to keep an eye on me. And they were very, very big helicopter parents. Like they were always just hovering over me, and they were always making sure that I was where I was needing to be. And it's just very. I mean, I think because I was an only child, they were very like always worried, you know what I mean, about me. And so, but she did work there for a little bit, and so she was just kind of overseeing what was going on with me and everything else. And so, but after kindergarten, I was one of those kids that had to be part of everything, excelled in everything. I had to be, if there was a performance, I was like the lead performer. It was always one of those things. It was always it was never really about competition. It was never even to this age, right, as old as I am. It was never a competition for me. It was always about, I was in competition with myself and how much I could push myself. It was always exceeding to the best of my abilities. So it was just always that for me. And then from there it was more like and as I was growing up, my dad always taught me to take care of myself and protect myself. So if anybody said anything, I would be able to protect myself. As to a point where I would go to places with my mom, and so a lot of these, my mom was obviously she um, again, right, going to anywhere we went. We left the house, we were always dressed up. We always, everybody had their, you know, dresses on and skirts on and, heels on and everything. And so, of course, you have your hair done, your makeup, everything. You go to the bazaar, you have to like dress up to go, right? So it was just one of those things where I was always protecting her, right? And like these men, we would be out walking, these men would, say something, right? Like throw a word or and I was always turning around, and I was the little kid. I was always turning around and was like, look one more time and I'll give you a 10 cents or something. You know what I mean? I was just kind of always trying to protect her that way. It's just, that's how I was taught, right? Growing up, it was always about protecting myself, protecting my loved ones. And so, and I think because dad was, I don't know if he was just, it was just like the culture, or dad was in the military, and that's kind of how he was just like, if anybody says anything to you, then this is how you protect yourself. And I think because I was a girl, and so just I think he didn't want boys pushing me around, you know so
I I get that for sure. Um, I think that we're always learning along the way on how we live and what do we need to do. And one of the things that kind of leads us to, you've talked about and given us a picture about where you're from and how you lived and what the town's like and food and clothes and school. And this kind of brings us back to healthcare. Why don't you share about how did you get healthcare where you were from? Because um, most likely this has impacted your journey in healthcare and why you're so passionate about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So medical care was very different. Back home, we had a clinic literally on top of our street. It was our street going up, and it was on top of the street. We had a clinic, and you really just went to the clinic when I remember one time I fell and I hit my eye, the bottom of my eye, on a it was a stair. And so like my eye just turned bloodshot, and so I had to go for that to the clinic. But mainly it was when I was growing up, we hardly went to the doctor. Everything was pretty much, taken care of, like, natural remedies and, all of that. So for me it was, I remember seeing our physician. We had a physician that was at the clinic for all the pediatrics, all the children. She would go, you know, once a year, she would go on our street and we would see her and we would just say hi to her. And she would just pass by and she would just be saying, is everyone well? Do you need anything? And we were like, nope, everybody's great. And that was it. and we never really had to go get seen. And then I remember I had a toothache and I went to the doctor, I went to the clinic. Everything was there. Everything was handled there. And I went to the clinic and they removed two of my teeth. And I was at that age where my teeth weren't coming back, and so they would just take them out. So they didn't do any type of fillers or anything like that. They would just take out your tooth. If it was hurting, they were taking it out. So it was just, yeah, it was just very, very difficult, right? Like the care was very different. And I think until today, care is very different there. But yeah, it was just, our immunizations were done at the kindergarten. That's when we got our immunizations. So, but I think that in a nutshell, that's kind of how healthcare was as I remember it. I mean, we did have a hospital, obviously, in the city. That's where my mom, delivered me. But mainly, we hardly ever went to the hospital. That's why I don't even remember it, that much.
Wow. Um, when I think about you saying that the doctor came by on the street and asked if everyone was
Doing
doing
well.
well,
Yeah.
it makes me feel like when we do our star measures, right? We're always checking to make sure everybody's good, but in a much different way, for sure. It
Yes.
was more like drive-by check-in, right? Um,
For
uh,
sure.
it never ceases to amaze me how we can deliver care, whether it's from the past or how we do it now, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, so if we fast forward and you're in school, um, did you have like summer breaks and were there other learning opportunities outside of school?
Yeah. So our school obviously was from first grade to 10th grade. We didn't go to 12, it wasn't 12 grades like here. And you started with the same class and you finished with the same class. Classes were very different. So what you have to remember is education's very different, right? So I started studying, I think, algebra in third grade. I was already starting to speak Russian, or I was learning Russian when I was in first grade, along with Armenian. So, and then I started learning French when I was in fourth grade. And I was studying physics in fourth grade. And I started learning chemistry in seventh grade. So I went up to seventh grade back home, halfway to seventh grade. And then that's when we came to US. But I was also with schooling and classes and everything else. I was also doing extracurricular activities where we had places where we would go to, and it was funded by the government, and you didn't have to pay like you do here. So we would learn, like I learned how to um, do like, I don't know. Is it? I don't even know what they do with the rugs. Like, do they? It's not sewing it, but it's kind of like there's a method to it that how you like do a
Like
rug.
pulling the yarn where you're making
Yeah,
rugs, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I learned how to do that. I was also doing needlepoint. I also learned how to do artificial flowers. So I was making artificial flowers from these tools that I had made out of metal. And my dad had it, actually got it for me. I don't know where he got it, but he got it for me. And I remember them spending a lot of money on that too at the time, because I was so into that. And they wanted to make sure that I did it, because we had to pay for the tools ourselves. They weren't providing that, but they were teaching you how to do those things. And then I did a little bit of dance, which you know me, I love dancing. And so I did a little bit of dance behind dad's back, because my dad always thought that, dancing wasn't, my future. It wasn't anything I was going to do with that. So he'd never really supported it. So I did it for a little bit until I got caught. And so then so then I didn't do it anymore. But, it was fun while it lasted. So I had a lot of fun doing it for sure.
And you mentioned, when you were in seventh grade, your parents, made the decision to come to the US. So can you share a little bit about when someone makes a big decision like that, what kind of process is it to 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 get that going, and what do you remember having to do?
Yeah, I remember, of course, a lot of the things were happening in the background, right? Because I didn't know, all I knew is at some point we were going to be coming to America, but I didn't know all the details that until I got older, obviously, my dad had been really diligently working on this for, I think it was in the works for like a few years by the time we came, because it was a process. We had to get paperwork from here, and there was just a lot that I remember him kind of mentioning things, but I was young, and so I didn't understand it all and how it all went, works. And so I remember all I remember is one time my parents said, "Well, we're going to be going to Moscow." And I'm like, "Why are we going to Moscow?" And we had to fly there. I remember, as we took a plane, and they said, "Oh, we have to go through this health assessment. They have to make sure that we're healthy and everything's okay, because that's part of the process for us to go to America." And I was like, "Okay." So I remember going to Moscow and going through the embassy, and we had to, do our health assessments, and they had to make sure that we didn't have any diseases that we were bringing to this country. And you had to be cleared before you could even come here. So, and we also went through an interview process as well. So we traveled twice. One time it was, I mean, they didn't really ask me much because I was, so young, but they were basically asking a lot of questions about who were we coming to, see here, and who we had here, and how they were related, and just kind of making sure and confirming all the information, even though they had it. But yeah, we didn't go through everything that had to do with the US. It was going through Moscow. It wasn't even going through Armenia, until obviously we had to get the acceptance from, or the release, I should say, from Armenia to come here. But that's kind of how, in a nutshell, it was. A process. That was the process until we got accepted, and then they send us a packet with all of our information that we were accepted by the US.
I learn more about you every time we talk. I thought I knew everything about you, and I'm still learning. But thank you for sharing about the beginning of your journey. And I know in the upcoming podcasts, we'll be hearing more about what it was like to be here, and subsequently how you came to your career. And you can share more about that. And we'll be looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much. And I hope it was enjoyable for everybody, and absolutely more to come. And thank you for joining me today.
Absolutely.
We'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
The most fun way to watch us is on YouTube, so be sure to like and subscribe. Also, you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and listen on Apple and Spotify as well. If you would like to learn more about a specific topic, please reach out to us by email. You can find all this information below in the show notes.